Hello everybody, welcome to this morning's stream. Thought I'd just give people a few moments to join. We've had a few join in that time, so probably good that I did. So today's stream, the title, I think we might need to shift this around because it's maybe not quite reflecting what I'm going to cover today on stream. But this is about curation versus creation. So when should we curate content from external sources, whether they be paid for or free and open source? And when should we create things in-house? It's a challenging topic. I've worked on both sides of the fence with this, and I understand, the pros and cons for each, and I have some kind of slides or some points here that touch on those, and some of those may be quite understandable to a lot of people, but I think for some people, it's often forgotten the pros and cons. And I also think there are some subtleties that aren't always considered, and definitely through my time as a consultant back into L&D functions, that's what I saw, particularly related to cost and time associated when you create your own content, associated with maintaining it particularly. So what I'd like to do today is touch on a few of those pros and cons, and discuss the idea of when would be right to do so and what are some of the indicators. The true answer is, is there a defined right and wrong? No, because like all these things, there was always an argument for and against something. But there might be situations where, it makes sense to step back, take a moment and go, should I be curating this or should I be creating it? And there's, I think that's something that frankly I try and put into everything that I do, take a step back and think about the best way forward. So this is going to serve well for people that might need a nudge in from the memory department in that area. So without much further ado, I'll jump into some of those points about curation or creation. And I'm going to get that wrong multiple times. So please correct me in the chat. Speaking of which, the chat is open. Please feel free to post comments, your opinions, questions that you have, challenges that you have. I'm going to be touching and whistling through some of this quite quick, and then maybe touching on some specifics that I've seen in the past where there were maybe decisions that were taken for various reasons or challenges that people had in choosing which route to go down. But I'd love to hear stories from you, the viewers, on what's going on in your world and how you and historically what you've seen. Remember, we're always trying to tie this at the moment to COVID, but I think these lessons or these points are relevant regardless of whether we're in COVID or not. It's just at the moment, the pace at which we need to do things is that much more rapid. So please like, share if you are, if you come via LinkedIn, please let everybody know. Let's build the community that we have on stream. The more people we have here, the more input we get from everybody, the better it is. Like, subscribe, all those normal things, but let's get into it. So the first thing that I wanted to touch on, let's go with create first. So, and bear with me one moment as well. We have there's a couple of things I'm doing different with technology. So if something goes a bit funny here, I will sort it. But after last stream, we had some audio issues. So hopefully this audio here is better than it was before. Okay, create benefits. So creation of content is one of those things that it takes time. But the biggest benefit that you see, and the reason that people do it most of the time, is the fact that it provides you full control over what you're doing, whether that's from a branding perspective, where it's from the content itself, in terms of the language that's used inside of that. You can make it business or audience specific, for example. As I said, the look and feel, the branding, but more than that, it's about you could have a consistent theme across a specific run of learning or a course. Let's say you're developing a leadership program and you want it to be branded or within, not just your company branding, but also that within like a leadership excellence program, for example. You can do that, and you can do that across all mediums, whether it's, handouts, whether it's a webinar thumbnail, whether it's the actual deck that you're using, maybe in face-to-face or a webinar setting, any video content. Really, the list is endless when it comes to those kind of things. And that consistent look and feel, and frankly, full control, is by far the biggest benefit of creating your own content. It's also worth noting that if you have good people in the business to create that content, whether that's rapidly or because their subject matter or their subject knowledge is so good and so invaluable that you couldn't get it elsewhere, makes sense. Go with the create option. Love to hear your thoughts on any other benefits you have, but I'm going to jump to create. What were we saying? Create negatives, I think I called them. Let me just check. Why are you not moving forwards? Apologies, it's not moving my slide. There we go. So create negatives, or detractors. Maybe that's a better word than negatives. Potentially costly. Now, I say on the previous slide, I actually said potentially, not too costly, but in this sense, I actually also think it could be. With creation of content, there's an unseen cost, and that cost is how long did it take to train that person to be able to create that content. Now, you would argue that that's actually spread over, if the more content they create, the more that gets spread across this piece of content, and therefore the cost of that initial training and upskilling has, decreased over time, probably to the point where it's negligible potentially. But if that's a new person coming to the business, or there's someone that's not necessarily created a load of content, or it's a new way of doing something, they have to be upskilled, and that is a cost associated with that. I've seen that a lot when the transition was made from, when people made the transition from face-to-face to using more webinars or to using more video content. There had to be an upskilling, and particularly in the topic of video, that often actually got pushed out to another part of the business, or they upskill people inside their organisation or employed new people to do that. But it all comes at a cost. The other point as well to think about when it comes to cost is maintenance, which kind of obviously touches on point 2 there, but there is a need to maintain. When you create a piece of content, I remember doing a piece of research going on maybe 7 or 8 years now, but the piece of research essentially found from a vast number of large organisations here in the UK, that content wasn't being looked at really inside 12 months of its creation. And actually a lot of content, and we're talking somewhere in the region of about 20-30%, hadn't been looked at in over 2 years. Now, the question I have, particularly when we come to things that revolve around technology, and even just its positioning, from a political perspective or a business perspective, those softer skills things, they still need to be positioned in the current day with the future in mind. They need to be updated more regularly than that. And often people don't do that. But if you are maintaining your content, then there is an inherent cost of doing so. Which, as you see when we come to this slide around curation, you wouldn't have that cost. That's on the provider of said content. But the need to maintain it is a big one. And there's also another cost associated with maintenance piece, is that technology. We are, particularly now with COVID, but even so beforehand, we're using technology more and more. And that technology moves forward at a vast pace. Think of, let's think about e-learning content or video content that was created using Flash. 3, 4, 5 years ago, Flash was, the way to create content or package content for the web. Now, Flash is dead as a medium. So any content that was created in that platform now has to be changed. Arguably, my last point, it should have been changed by now. But if it hasn't been, it has to be done. And when that transition took place, there would have been a lot of people wanting to go in, edit content that maybe they only made 6 months ago, and suddenly found they were unable to edit, and well, they could have edited it, but maybe not published it because of its lack of support on browsers today. So the fact is, we're always adopting new technologies. So even when you've learned a technology, or you've created a piece of content, you need to be aware that that could shift almost at any point, particularly when we rely so heavily on technology. And the final one on the create is lack of speed. Now this is a big variable, possibly like the potential cost piece, where it depends upon the resource you have internally. You could have a resource that's really rapid at creating creating content. You could have a heavily templated approach when it comes to creating content, so that helps speed up time. You could have software and technology again that helps. Things like authoring tools and video tools that are smart and use AI to create content. So they can all help, but fundamentally, even with that in mind, you still have to storyboard. You still have to consider the flow for the user through that piece of content or pieces of content, and you have to go through that process. No matter how you cut it, a curated piece of content where someone else has done the legwork for you is always going to be quicker. Now, some of you may go, well, what about the procurement process? And yes, I completely agree. The procurement process, does add some time, particularly if you're buying large catalogues of content. But if we're talking about single piece of content, or we're talking about, once that procurement process has been completed, if you costed that for a large catalogue out, you are going to be the bang for your buck is going to be much better, and I'll touch on that when we talk about curated in a moment. But those are my negatives or detractors. I don't like the word negatives, so I'm going to use detractors. So create, benefits, and detractors. So what I'm saying here is it's really, I would be using the create content when I've got the option where time isn't of an issue, so potentially maybe not so much right now, or at least be limited, but also where I'm desperate for that look and feel to be on brand, whatever that brand might be. That would be where I'd be looking at it, and probably that's no surprise to the majority of you. Let's jump to where are we? Let's jump to curate. My slides have gone out of order. My apologies for that. I don't know why they're going out of order. So let's look at curate benefits. So in terms of curation, when I mean curate, what we're looking here is there's potentially a number of sources, but let's think about third-party libraries that are maintained, so therefore probably purchased. We can, and I may touch on it, curation of content outside of that. In fact, I will touch on that because it's a very valuable source of information. But for the moment, for the purpose of the next slide or two, let's just talk about libraries, external libraries that are maintained by a content creator or provider. So big benefit is speed. We were just touching on it. When someone is curating content for you, they're doing all the legwork in terms of coming up the source material. They're doing all the creation. They're even doing curation on platform, often into specific learning paths or packages that you can just pull straight into your systems and provide to your learners. The only delay you would have is a procurement process for that content. And as I said, if you factor in the procurement process time, particularly, they can be quite quick, to be fair, nowadays. But if you factor that in and even say that's a lengthy process, and then consider the vast amount of content that you can get from a library such as, say, LinkedIn, the actual procurement time per asset is very, very minimal. So whilst I get the argument to say, yes, it might not necessarily be immediate, the reality is that if you're already subscribed to a library, go and look at what's in there and curate the content from that source. We're only talking about situations where you have no pre-curated content or no external library, where that time delay might be a factor. And invariably now, you're even getting to the point where you can get trial accounts. People will provide you access, and you can shift over at a later date with a larger cohort. So there's loads of options to rapidly get to content now from paid-for third-party resources. Low maintenance, I kind of have touched on that already, but again, you're not doing any of the legwork. You are not maintaining that content over a period of 3, 4, 5, 6 months, years even. And you're not doing any of the tagging and all that kind of stuff that you need to do in the background to make sure it's findable and indexed on your LMS or LXP. Furthermore, you're not maintaining software, so there's actually a saved cost there. You haven't had to make that investment into the technology to create those pieces of content. The other big benefit of the maintenance piece, and it's maybe related to speed and the ability to maintain content, is the fact that those organisations who are creating content, typically their sole purpose is to create content. As an L&D function, you are obviously providing learning and a way for... I can see chat disconnected. it seems to have right itself. If anybody's still around in chat, please post up just to say that you're still there. But so what was I saying? I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, so we're talking about maintenance there. Nope, I've lost it. I had lost it. Anyway, in chat, what was I talking about, chat, when I just lost my train of thought? When I saw that the chat had disconnected and it panicked me. What was I talking about? I've never gone blank like that before. Hi everybody, I can see you. Good to know that it is now working. I was talking about maintenance, or the maintenance of content, the perspective of oh, I know what it was. It was updating content. Sorry, apologies for that, everybody. So maintaining content, you are trying to their sole purpose is to maintain and create content. Your sole purpose as an L&D function, well, you do have a sole purpose, but it's not specifically related always to the content. Sometimes it's providing guidance as to where you might go, with like personal development, as well as creating content, as well as building a culture of learning. There's lots of things that go into an L&D function that sit outside of the creation of content. So it's understandable that as an L&D function you can't create that or maintain that as rapidly, as readily as those third-party paid-for libraries can. It depends upon their update schedule how often they do that, but the best ones are updating their content all the time and are rapidly reacting to changes that are taking place. Classic point, let's take GDPR. GDPR was, as everyone knows, a few years back, was a big change in Europe for data protection. And at the time I was working for a company that creates content, and that went through various iterations whilst the legislation was still being written, and courses were released, and the legislation, even after its release date, still continued to be changed. So we were constantly updating that content as the legislation shifted to keep pace with that. We then rolled that out to obviously all our customers at the time. And how quickly would an L&D function be able to keep pace with that change across multiple assets related to specifically GDPR? And you might have that in multiple areas, because the GDPR might have been important, yes, within the GDPR course, but it also probably would have come up in other courses around data protection, even if it was by way of reference. So it was a big process to constantly keep that content updated, and probably the external third-party library is probably more well suited to that in the L&D function. Obviously, that is notwithstanding the actual setup of your specific L&D function. The final point is kind of again related to the previous one about they're designed for content creation, and that's what they are. They're a machine of content creation. Is a lot of topics have a vast library, particularly those where you go to so soft skills, we know the world over has got content coming from every single source, but even libraries that are very industry specific, there will be a number of creators of content that have got a great library that suits what you need, down to a T. The ability to access that at pace and it be maintained is huge, in my opinion. And if there is externally created content that's recognised as a good standard or a great standard for the industry, then why would you not? Why would you recreate the wheel? Why would you spend your time and resources on content that would 100% serve the purpose, or even arguably 90% serve the purpose? And maybe we'll touch on that as I finish these slides momentarily, about where and when I would think I would use it. But yeah, that's a big benefit. So what about the detractors then? And apologies, I'm going to be skipping through a couple of these to find the slide that's seemingly out of order. Negatives / detractors. Curation, no control. So we said the biggest benefit for Create was the fact that you've got, almost infinite control. The opposite obviously is true of curated content. You may be able to get someone that brands their content to your liking, a logo here or some colorways there, but generally speaking, the reality is that you're probably going to find that that content is unbranded, and does not reference your organisation or the specifics of your setup, or industry, potentially, depending on its source, in any way, shape or form. Now that's probably, for a lot of applications, not that problematic, but at the same time, it may be something that is a deal breaker, and that's completely fine. I'm a big advocate of building a sense of brand and a theme throughout a piece of content so that it's easily identifiable. Doing that with external content is challenging, and it's hard to maintain a consistent look and feel across a piece as well, particularly if you're curating from multiple sources. A YouTube video here, some LinkedIn content there, something from Open Sesame over here, and maybe then some content that you've created in-house. Very hard to pull that together to feel cohesive. When you look at the standalone elements, you then have to start heavily leaning on your LMS or LXP or platform of choice to pull that together to form a succinct and congruent narrative. But nonetheless, it's the trade-off, isn't it? Great content, or potentially great content, speed, lack of control. You've got to decide that for yourself. I've got curate costs as another detractor is costs, maybe. So this is going to be an interesting one, because I have seen people spend, for what some organisations, there's a small amount of money, let's say £10,000 on a library of content, and then not use it at all. So they buy that content library, they spend their 10k, and then suddenly, no one's using that content. Maybe they did in the first few weeks or months, but then it just, wasn't used again. So the question there is, what's the return on investment there? And I've seen organisations spend hundreds of thousands on content libraries and use that throughout their entire organisation and do a really great job at signposting at content and recommending content to their learners. And the cost per minute, or per head, or however you want to align your cost or ROI model or whatever it may be, the reality is that was hugely beneficial and a cost-effective way of delivering training. So this is where the cost maybe comes in. So for me, the cost maybe is actually around, it's less about the actual amount that you pay for the content and more about how well utilized it is. There is a cost when you go out to procure content. There is a cost associated with it, but the more people you can push through it, and the more you can utilize that library and utilize economies of scale when purchasing said content, the better you will be. Purchasing it, a piece here and a piece there, that's going to be more expensive than going out and buying a whole library from a content provider. But you have to make sure that whole library has there's a break-even point, or in fact, a point where it becomes hugely cost-effective through the numbers. It's just as simple as that. I've actually worked on a number of times with business cases for organisations where they said, well, this content provider will only sell us this whole library, and we only want 50% of it. And I had to talk to them and say, well, let's crunch the numbers on it. How many people are going to use that 50%? And the answer was, well, everybody in the organisation, or something to that effect. And you calculate that across your organisations. And I said, well, look, ignore the other 50% you're not using, and let's focus on the 50 that you are. And actually, your bang for your buck is excellent. You're still getting really, really good content for a cheap price. View that other content as nice to have if you require it, but you don't need it. You don't need to signpost it. You don't need to even think necessarily of further curating it on your own platform. If you don't want to use it, we don't think it's relevant, don't do so. But with the stuff you do want to do, you're still getting a great price. And it's hard to, it's sometimes hard for organisations to kind of make that calculated decision, particularly when it comes to the cost, because you feel like you're paying for things that you don't necessarily require. But I would urge people to look at it from a more objective point of view and a more statistical point of view to say, if my audience uses X, what will that look like in terms of value for me? But obviously, always try and get the library that you require. I would never advocate otherwise. But just think about it that way if you are being forced down the route of taking courses that you wouldn't necessarily think you would require. And who knows, there was a surprisingly number in that situation, or a couple of those situations, where people did use the other content when it was made available. And it's COVID, COVID-19. Maybe people will branch out and go deeper than they would have ever done before. So who knows? The final point on curation, from a detractor's point of view, and I know there are others, but this is my kind of top list of all of these, is it's difficult to source niche content. And by that, what I mean is, yes, we get industry-specific providers, 100%. You get, even if I think of a very specific topic like first aid, the Red Cross produce huge amounts of content that you can procure. But what about when you get more specific? What I've worked with organisations in the past that are in manufacturing, and they have a piece of machinery that they use. They have the training from that manufacturer potentially, or maybe a body that or an organisation that use that or have created training specifically for it, that piece of machinery. But then beyond that, there's nothing. It's all then it's guesswork. So if you need to create, or you need to have training against how that's used in your business, or like smart ways to use that piece of machinery or software or whatever it may be, or that process, if you can't curate it, you obviously have to create it. And invariably, when it's that niche, you can't. So for large libraries where there's a common topic area, and that's why soft skills get so much focus, in my eyes. But the point is, there are libraries, but then the more niche you go, the harder it will be to find those, and it will force you down that create route regardless. Although I would caveat that by saying there's always the option of using curated content to a point, and then just using, then continue with created content for the stuff that's very business specific, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But those are my positives and negatives. I'm conscious I've just rattled those off in the last 20 minutes or so. So I now know chat is working. It turned itself back on, and I can see messages in there. So any questions from the chat on what I've discussed, any thoughts, anything they'd add to any of those negatives, positives from either the create or the curate perspective? I'll just leave that open for a few seconds where people can type if they are doing so. But as you do that, remember the chat's there all the time, and I'm rambling. You can just talk, cut in, and I will stop what I'm talking about, and I'm looking at the chat, monitoring it at all times. So, and if anybody is posting to chat, I'll also say it's probably a good time to do it. That we have, obviously I'm streaming now, and I stream every Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m. We've also got a webinar going out this afternoon at, I believe it's 2 p.m. Yes, 2 p.m. GMT. Around data, which is with a colleague of mine from the US, Chris Cameron, and also a great external consultant I mentioned in the last stream, Lori Niles-Hofmann. Great, I can see it coming. I can see the chat coming through already. Sorry, there was a bit of a delay there. Great webinar around the use of data. I am going to do a stream on data, whether it's next week or maybe the week after, but it will. I'm obviously going to watch the webinar later today, and the link is in the description for this video once it goes live. And in fact, you can see that now as you're on here as well. But the webinar will be great, and she's a really great talk, has great insight. We share a lot of similar views in regards to data. So when I run my stream on that, we'll be doing it on probably building on the topics that are discussed, and then anything that we talk about on stream, as we always do. So a couple of questions that came in, or a couple of points. So Annabelle, great that you agree. Well, I hope so. Start the end goal. Yeah, and I said that on first stream. It's always about starting the end goal, and that's what I'm going to touch on next, about which one would I choose when, and how do I go through, or how would I advise people going through their thought process. And it's kind of pulling all the things I've discussed together, and then some other stuff as well to think about the overall flow of learning for an individual or a learner group. But completely agree. That end goal should always be something in your mind. Why am I doing this? What is the purpose? What is it supposed to be delivering in terms of value? It has to be paramount, to the point where stick a sticker on your wall, or write it on a big piece of A3 paper and stick it up there and say, why am I doing this? What's the purpose? Again, it's that I said it about the start here, about taking a step back and thinking about how you go about doing something, but taking that step back and thinking about the why you're doing it, to remind yourself periodically. That is something that's hugely beneficial if you're trying to make sure you keep on track. So yeah, excellent. Phil's asked, is there a relationship between curation and creation? Because when you create your reference material, you have used to create material that exists in the library. Well, I'm going to read that again. Is there a relationship between curation and creation? Because when you create your reference material, you have used to create material that exists in the library of curation. That's a confusing way of wording that. I'm not quite understanding what's being said there. Could you elaborate, Phil? I'm not quite... Maybe... I have had a coffee this morning, but it doesn't necessarily mean I am firing on all cylinders. Whilst you do that, Phil, I'll jump onto Annabelle's point. Whether create or curate and take into consideration contextual factors such as cost and time. Yeah, so maybe I start pushing onto that and thinking about what the actual, how I would go through my thought process. I'm going to stay. I was thinking about going back to full screen mode, but I think actually I'll stay on these slides and I'll probably jump between them as we talk. Maybe reference a couple of points. So, whenever I'm going in and creating or choosing whether or not I create or curate content, the question, as you say, always has to be, what's the end goal? But for me, that end goal is multifaceted. Yes, I want to drive a business result or a skill improvement. Let's just say that, and assuming it's aligned to the business, obviously. Although I think in some contexts, to allow personal development without necessarily worrying too much about the business goal is useful, particularly in this day and age we find ourselves in with COVID, where self-improvement is a big thing, and people have time to do it. So let's just say it's about improving a skill or a capability in an area. That's obviously hugely important. But I'm also, whenever I'm putting out content out there, I'm also thinking about how are they engaging with me? How are they learning? Am we presenting it in a way that they'd like to learn? And I'm going to use the word curate here, but am I, curating that or pulling it together on platform that is a way that suits that audience? And also, what modality do I want to use? So for all that bundled together essentially comes to, how do I want to make that learner feel as they're going through that content, and how do I want them to also feel about having achieved the skill? So for me, that whole point about with the goal in mind, my goal is never it's never singular in terms of its focus. It's always multifaceted. So if I think about that, then I'm pulling in, well, okay, so what kind of factors go into that? So let's take the business ones. The business factors or the capability area about moving the skill forward. That, how fast does that need to be? That's probably the biggest one that I would start to think about when it comes to curate versus create. Because at the end of the day, it dictates largely the avenues that I can go down. Let's take COVID right now, for example. We are constantly getting updates from the government and other news sources about COVID-19, and there are people creating videos, guides, infographics, you name it. There's stuff out there on the web. If you search COVID-19 in a term, a modality, you'll get something. So that content is constantly being updated, and if we want to provide our own content at the same pace that people are finding elsewhere, which arguably you'd probably need to do, you need to be on the ball. You need to be creating that. You need to have someone dedicated to that right now in the business, that every day they're going to wake up in the morning and say, right, what was on the press conference last night? Okay, I need to push that into content today. That's the reality of it. How is this affecting our business? Our operating procedures. Whether it be HR, whether it be actual just business. Business processes, your outreach to your customers, whatever it might be. It's having an effect, and you've got to pull all that in to your content and then get that published that day before the next wave hits. I spoke quite fast there, but the reality is that's the way you're going to work. It's a lot to maintain. It's a lot to do. So in that situation, I would be looking at it and going, right, which bits have to be? Well, at the moment, everything's got to go out fast. So that's the first port of call. So the speed at which I can publish content is the number one factor in the COVID content situation right now. Okay, which bits of that then can I curate, and which bits of that do I need to create? So the BBC, for example, and I'm not endorsing the BBC in any way, shape or form, but if I go on my BBC app on my iPhone right now, there's actually very little like news on there, and it's loads and loads of stuff related to COVID, like a guide or an update or a video on how to wash your hands, or about social distancing and the benefits, or how that works in the real world. There's content. It's not the only source. There are loads of others, but there is content out there. As I was just saying, I curate it. I would literally pull that content in and say, this is a guide that, say where it's come from, it doesn't matter, but there's a guide here. You don't need to do the legwork. What would be more beneficial is L&D partnering with the business to understand how HR policies are changing and potentially rolling out, or either in conjunction with the comms team or as a piece of bespoke training that you might use some sort of rapid authoring tool to create and get it out the same day, but getting something that's business specific. And there would probably be only a few of those after you've done, you've curated the majority of the training content that you're going to use from other sources. You're essentially reducing the mountain that you need to climb in terms of creation of material. That's the way I'd look at it. So in that situation, I'd be using both methodologies, because I can deliver at speed with the creation as long as I'm not expecting it to be perfect and it does the job it needs to do. But the majority of the things that I would be using would be curated in that situation. Like, let's then go like something that's different. And I mentioned a leadership program before, and leadership and sales training is close to my heart from various points in my career. So let's go with leadership. Big leadership change program. Going to go out to the top 50 leaders in your organization. Would I curate or create that? Well, let's again think about the things that needs to happen. From a business perspective, could you meet the skills and the skills or capabilities uplift that the training needs to deliver via either methodology? And I would argue, without obviously knowing the specifics, yes, you could probably find a library that does that really well, and you could probably find you could have the in-house resource to be able to do the same. So let's assume those two are equal. So there's no real benefit potentially, and again, it's going to depend on the situation and what you're trying to do. But let's assume there's no benefit to either approach in terms of the quality or depth of knowledge you can utilise in that training. Speed might become less of an issue, because if you're rolling out a leadership development program, you're planning this, let's say 6 months in advance, and it's going to roll out 6 months from now, and you can actually still be creating some of the latter content as the first parts of that training are rolling out. As long as you've got your roadmap, you've got enough bandwidth and time to create content. So let's not go with that one. So that's not the issue. So then it's a question of probably coming to the things that I was talking about, that I think about as well as the business need, which is, how do you want to make people feel? And I'd be weighing up those points. Now, so a lot at the moment we're talking about, say, creating communities of learning, making people feel included. And again, it's related to COVID, but also before that, we were seeing a trend where people are now using Teams and Slack, and in fact one of the streams next week is talking about the use of social, or getting social with learning. So we'll touch us on that, but building that community of learners, whether it's they're self-authoring content, or they're just they're able to talk to each other and interact with each other in a deeper way than they would have done before. If you're trying to do that, there may be an argument to say you want to create the content, and here's why. Maybe you want to create the content because across the various platforms that you use, or the pieces of content that you use, from the comms piece to the actual training itself, to assets that they can utilize in their day-to-day work, and even in terms of like branding, so that when people talk about it in the business, it has a specific name that's your brand or your internal brand. Then there's a real argument for going down the creation route, largely with that content, because it provides you that flexibility. But there are great libraries out there, but it's just understanding that they're probably not going to be tailored to the specifics that you might want to go down. Now again, I'm talking about libraries like a LinkedIn here. There's a difference when you get external providers, training companies that create bespoke training. Obviously, they're essentially doing your creation, but they've outsourced it. So those I view as create as opposed to curate. And I haven't touched on that distinction, and there are obviously differences there. And it's worth noting that my create was something that you create internally, because typically when I see create, that's most of the time how organisations work, just as that caveat. So for me, it'd be like, well, what do you want? How do you want people to feel there? And I think for me, it would be, if I was creating a leadership program, I would want to create a cohort of leaders that were talking to each other and sharing best practice. So I would probably lean more heavily on the create route. However, and there's a caveat, it doesn't mean you can't curate content. And I said it before, there are other sources outside of libraries like YouTube's, around the web, such as like LinkedIn articles, and frankly even other pieces of content training. You can still provide to that audience a supplementary learning, because it would be a benefit to them. So, I don't see there being a clear distinction they're not mutually exclusive. It doesn't need to be one or the other. But what I would say is that I would probably think that the backbone or the core of your program will probably end up leaning to one or other of these, just because of the fact that you will then end up with some degree of consistency. Even a curated library can have consistency if they have a large enough library that has, say, a leadership program. It just might not be perfectly aligned to, say, the values that you have in your business or the way that you want your leaders to behave. There might be some subtleties, and that's why you might go, better to create. So in that situation, as I said, for me, a lot of it would be about how you want people to feel when they're going through it. How do you want to build that experience? And maybe that's coming from a platform perspective, but whenever I'm thinking about experience, I'm also thinking about, will they come back for more training? Will they go through this leadership program and go, do you know what? That was really good. I got value from it. It worked in the way I wanted to. And I'm now kind of enthused or encouraged by the fact that I will be able to go back onto platform and find more training, because ultimately that's what we want them to do as an L&D function. A couple more questions came from the chat there whilst my ramblings were going on. So Phil, when you create a course like a leadership course, is it an idea to recommend content that exists in the content library? Yeah, for sure it is. So I kind of, to my point about, I don't see it as one thing at all. I think the term curation is a challenge, because we obviously are curating content on platform that we have created. But when we're talking about curation in this context, we're obviously talking about external libraries that we're pulling in as opposed to creating it in-house. But I would say, I don't think there's any right or wrong way to do these things. If you think there's supplementary learning, whether it's a webinar, a video, an event, an infographic, pull it in. You don't know what value people derive from those sort of things. I mean, I like the options that we provide on platform, that we can create groups inside our learning path and provide people with the option to choose the modality, the option that they want to use when they're learning that specific point. So they could choose a webinar, a podcast, a video, a strict piece of e-learning, a white paper, and as long as they all cover the same topic or similar, we say, well, any of those would be, you can complete one of those 4 or 5 that I listed, and that's the equivalent of doing any of them. So, that's nice, and that could include curated and creator content. All I'm saying is that just be mindful of the fact that the positives and the negatives, or the benefits and the detractors that I've spoken about on here will apply, and it would be wrong to be not aware of those when you put in that specific piece of content. So if I pulled in a third-party piece of learning, let's say I'm running this leadership program, and then I pull something in from LinkedIn, and the way it's pitched is different to the way that I've been, explaining our leadership values, or the way that we want our leaders to lead. It's just being mindful of that you don't have full control. They might use a different word to mean the same thing that you mean, but there is a difference in terminology, therefore, and it might confuse some people. The branding looks different, as I said before, and the overall flow and look and feel will be different. It doesn't mean it's wrong, it's just that it's different, and it doesn't, and it might jar, it might not, but it's just being aware that there is that challenge. Hannah's put a question about talking about people feeling included. Who should I involve in the process of collecting and or creating learning content? We've touched on this a number of times on different streams, Hannah. We got, for me, I would include as many people as possible. I mean, L&D should be business partnering, and now the tools that we have available to curate, create, and the time-saving tools that we have, and collaboration tools like Teams and Slack, we should be talking to the business about what they need. But we also, I'm a big fan of self-authoring, providing the tools to the people to actually create their own content that gets pushed onto platform. And you might go, well, that's going to lose a whole load of control. But the answer is no. You know, you can, a lot of these tools now, you can set templates, or you can create an approval process or workflow that means that I can self-author some content. It goes to an approval body, might get front and back ended with some nice slides and imagery in front, to make it feel on brand. And what you've got is created content that didn't require the L&D function, has credibility from the business, and is now on platform in a very short space of time with very little like kind of effort on the L&D's behalf, apart from maybe fact checking a few tweaks here and there. So that to me is a really smart way, and it doesn't largely involve the L&D function, and actually is a great way of engaging people. But that's just one example. There are lots and lots of examples. But definitely business partnering and working with the business or the people that sit within it, is a really big one. Annabelle, thanks for your question or your points. I think learners appreciate a variety of media. Yes, curated and creative. Agreed. As long as it's relevant and makes for a richer learning experience. I couldn't agree more. And as I said, it is about a blend. It's about choosing the right thing at the right point in time. I would never advocate for one or the other, and I think there is often a need for a blend. And I'm a big fan of not reinventing the wheel and working efficiently. There's so much content out there on the web. It's unbelievable how much free information is available to people. And I think I probably did mention this in a previous stream, but Google is the most used search engine on the web. And the second most used search engine on the web is YouTube, which is Google, but just specifically YouTube. So when you think about it from that perspective, we're saying that Google has the top two search engines. So anybody, and that's by a wide margin as well. You're essentially saying that when everybody searches, they're doing it on Google. So Google knows everything about what to provide to people, and there is huge amounts of content on YouTube. There is so much there that you can leverage. I had something just for this stream earlier today where something wasn't quite working for me, and now, although the slides are out of order, the slides are now moving more smoothly between views. I've just got to work out why they're not going in the order I designated. But the point is that I jumped on there, 5 minutes, got the information. If I was working for a company that uses software all the time, and I needed to train someone on that, why would I go out and create the training myself? Just point to that video that I went on because it was really good, made by someone that uses the software on a regular basis. It's a no-brainer to me. But as you say, it is about using both. Phil, again in the chat, thank you. If you decide to buy content in from Skillsoft or Webcast, how do you evaluate the quality of the content? Yeah, it's a great question. The honest answer is that's part of your RFP process. The reality is with a curated library, there will be parts of the content that are better than others as well. You have they will have cycles by at the points at which they actually do improve the content. So because of that cyclical basis, it might be that some content doesn't get actually updated for a year or so because it isn't deemed that it needs one. So when you go through that review process, it's good to do a broad cross section of a variety of different libraries if that's something that you are purchasing. In terms of then the quality, you got to sit through it. You got to go through it and go through it with those kind of the same points we said before of having the end goal in mind. Is this going to deliver to my audience? Do I know what my audience like? Do I know how they like to consume learning? So, if your audience is made up of people that have low attention spans, and so I could be talking about a specific audience here, let's say a sales function, short on time, so it's not low attention spans, just short on time, need bite-sized chunks of content. If I then go to a library, and let's say for example here it's Skillsoft, and that library is full of content, but the content's all 10, 11-minute videos, is that going to work? They're probably going to watch like a bit of the video and then switch off or skip through the video to the bits that they need. But it's still taking time, and it's not easy for them to navigate that content. So what I might be better off doing is finding a company that specifically has learning on that topic pitched it, in the right way. So now we're kind of merging the previous streams we had about what is the right piece of content and the right modality you to use at that point in time, with the right, whether it's curated or created. And that might then dictate the actual companies that you go and talk to about the curated libraries or created content. So we're getting into like multiple degrees of requirement here, which are all super relevant for working out where you pull your content from. If it's possible to go down that route, then that would be the route that I would go. And evaluate against a matrix. Maybe do some tests with an audience. If you can get licenses to see the content beforehand, put that audience through it. Just be mindful that when you do that, though, I've seen this done before where people test with subject matter experts, and it is often hard for a subject matter expert, unless you're very good at taking yourself out of it and putting yourself in the shoes of those less learned than yourself. It can be quite hard for them to actually understand that content, if it pitched at a basic level, is actually very, very appropriate for the audience that you or that content provider was targeting. So be careful with the audiences that you use, and probably take a cross-section. Take some people that have lower skill levels and take some people that are more experts. The experts are great at saying, well, that's all well and good, but that wouldn't build towards what we're trying to do as an end result. Fine. But likewise, the less learned would be able to say, but I have no knowledge and this is giving me the basics I think that I need. I can learn that there are other or better ways to do this later on, but for now I need to know the bare bones and the basics. So yeah, have a cross section when you're going through that evaluation process. Another question from Hannah: if I find something useful on YouTube, can I just pop it up on my learning platform straight up, or are there some copyright questions to consider? That is a great question. It depends upon the nature of that content, but here's the thing. YouTube, when people put something on YouTube and it's publicly listed, not an unlisted piece or one. In fact, I'll touch on that. So on YouTube, there's multiple options. There's public, which means it's out there. People can view it from wherever. You don't even need a license for YouTube to log in and use it. If it's on there, you can use it to your heart's content. It's essentially open source. But I will come back and caveat that in a moment. There's another option which is unlisted, and in unlisted format, it means that it's available, but only if you have the link for that specific piece of content. However, it's still published on YouTube. You can use it. Just bear in mind that it is an unlisted piece of content, so not everybody can search for it. You can only get to it with a direct link, but you could still embed it inside of content that you have on your platform if you wanted to. The third option is private, which means that only the individual that created it can see it, and therefore you can't share it on platform. So that's the three. If you're putting stuff up to YouTube, that's the way to think about it. Jumping back to the first point about public, if people put content up there, and it's, like, I don't know, someone says, here's my way of, like, my leadership, top tips for leadership or dealing with change, or how to sell in, difficult situations, whatever it may be. They've put that video up there. You can use it to your heart's content. It's there, it's out there in the public. The only caveat is if people use content that isn't their own in their videos, and then you then use it, and it hasn't been pulled up by YouTube. So things that often get caught in that would be, and probably not too relevant, huge in the business world, but if someone uses something that's copyrighted, like a quote from a film or a TV show or a specific piece of music in their content, just bear in mind that is actually plagiarism unless they've paid for it or paid for the licensing. And you, even if they've paid for it, you then haven't licensed that copyrighted content yourself, so you shouldn't really be using it. That said, I've never seen anybody pulled up on their learning platform, because typically they're not trawled by those kind of copyright infringement things. YouTube has their own on platform that does that for you. It's an AI based algorithm that looks for movie, uses visual references for movies and sound for the audio files to see if there's anything that's copyrighted there. I myself have come up against this on other content I've published and actually have license to use the content for. So just bear that in mind. If it's on YouTube, you can use it to your heart's content. But if there's something that is got copyrighted material and you want to put it onto your platform, you can do so, and you're unlikely to get problems with it, but just bear in mind you don't, strictly speaking, have the rights. And that content may get taken down for a copyright infringement, and you would have a broken link then as a result of that. But just that's the only thing to bear in mind, I think. I don't think those organisations are coming after L&D functions, put it that way. But in the eyes of the law, you don't have control over that content. Any other questions? I'm conscious of time. I can't believe we ran for an hour on that already. But any questions at the end of the chat? Happy to take things offline as well. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, you can send me a message. I'm happy to continue the conversation about curation or creation or anything else we've talked about on stream. As I said, to kind of finish up, we've got a stream that goes out, a webinar going out on, when is it? Well, today, 3 o'clock today. No, 2 o'clock today, GMT. It's on our website, it's in the description. Please like, subscribe this, tell people that it's gone on. The video will be up goes up straight after this, so you can watch it again or link it out. And on LinkedIn,